Hi guys. Okay, so what I'm about to do is I'm going to project my screen for you as I'm going through various examples. I've taken one paragraph from the paper that Mr. Gwynn, the sample paper that we looked at together in class last semester, and then I've taken 3 paragraphs from sample papers that have come directly from you guys, but they're papers that I received permission to talk about in class. So what I'm going to be doing is to be talking about a revision technique to create more synthesis in your papers as you're finishing up. So let me flip back over to my screen and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so like I said, I have 4 different examples that we're going to look through, and what I've done is I've already gone through and I've color-coded them, and I really recommend that you do this as the final stage of writing as you're looking back over your paragraphs. Pick one color that you're going to use for topic sentences and final sentences and internal transitions. Basically, any kind of writing within your paragraph that links together all of your texts. And as you can see, I've chosen green. I then picked yellow for my first text, blue for my second, and this pink color for my third. And the reason for that is because then you can see that, look, there's no interaction. There are no moments beyond the transition sentences where you're able to see synthesis. And this is a paragraph from the sample paper where Mr. Gwynn had written in the comments that it would have been nicer if there had been more synthesis throughout. So I took it as an example. So if you'd like to pause your screen for a second, you can read through the paragraph. So I'll scroll through it slowly for you. But what I've done, if you're more interested in kind of the logic behind it, is I've copied and pasted it below and I've made some changes. And those changes I've highlighted in green. So you'll note that I've left the first work pretty much on its own. I haven't introduced anything new, and the reason for that is that it's often really useful to set up the idea that you're going to be talking about in the paragraph with one of your texts, and so that it's going to be difficult to kind of interrelate the text because you haven't yet set up all of the ideas. But once you have, you can add more. So what I've done here is I've just added a quick like Gatsby, but note that it draws a connection between this blue chunk and this yellow chunk. I've also, the original transition sentence highlighted the connection between Willie and the grandmother, but what I've done is I've made a connection between Willie, the grandmother, and Gatsby by saying, although the car is not her own, rather than saying just as Willie's. And the reason for doing that is that that way I'm able to bring Gatsby throughout the paragraph. You'll note that at the end of this paragraph, Mr. Gwynn was already doing a lot of good synthesis, and part of how you see that is this idea of in these stories. He's using the final quote from A Good Man is Hard to Find to make a point about all 3. So that's a really great model that you can use yourself. Okay, so now let's look at one of the paragraph examples from the class. And again, if you'd like, you can pause and you can skim through this quickly. This is a paragraph about masculinity. And again, you'll note that you see the 2 texts in just kind of a wall of text and then the green in between. So there is a transition sentence, right, with the idea of as it is in The Great Gatsby. And then there's a final sentence that seems to bring them together. And here are the changes that I've made. So if you look here, I've left the first text alone, again, because it's setting up this idea. But in the second text, I've created a few little asides that give me a way to connect Gatsby to Willie within the Gatsby example. So looking at the idea that those who are around Gatsby are like Willie because they're impressed by these superficial shows of wealth, you could reimagine this paragraph to think about how Gatsby sort of showing off his wealth to his audience is very similar to what Ben, Willie's brother, does in all of the hallucinations, right? I've also added here this sentence: Gatsby's means come to represent his masculinity, while Willie's lack of means highlights his futile pursuit of masculinity. In the original version, it just said that, masculinity could only happen if it's a person of great means, right? Then I've added in this idea that both authors are misconstruing masculinity. So basically, I've taken the final sentence here that was just about Gatsby, and I've expanded it to become about both Gatsby and Willie Loman, right? So those gray marks create more interaction within that second text. So let's look at this again. In this paragraph, again, you see 3 texts, and there's a little bit more synthesis at the end, but you see again those 3 walls of text. So if you'd like to pause and skim through it, you can. If we go down to the revised version, again, I've left the first text alone for the most part, but I've added a few sentences here. This one in the middle, the first one talks about the adultery with Hester, and the second one talks about Myrtle and her marriage. Both are connected by the fact that neither woman could really seek a divorce for financial reasons and kind of societal reasons for Myrtle, and it wasn't even an option for Hester. So what I've done is I've added that sentence, basically. This one ends on the idea of remaining with one spouse, so I've said divorce was not an option for Hester in the 17th century, but it's not much of an option for Myrtle in the 20th century either. Then I've kept the author's original sentence about American history, but I've changed the transition sentence. In the original version, it said, it had the idea of contrasting America with the Caribbean British colonies. But here, I've focused on this idea that women's sexuality must be controlled, and I've moved the idea of wildly different societies, the Caribbean British colonies, the 17th century, 20th century America, to the end here, and I've expanded it. Before, it just kind of jumped from America to the Caribbean, and you kind of lost that sense of Hester. This brings Hester along all the way throughout. And so we're seeing this. I am also highlighting the misogyny at the heart of their social institutions, which connects really well to the final paragraph. So you see how this is kind of woven throughout. All of these moments in gray could actually be highlighted in green, which would then show you just how much I've done here to create synthesis kind of throughout the paragraph and to break up those blocks of text, right? So if you look at the paragraph like this, you see the synthesis throughout. This last paragraph was actually originally a number of smaller paragraphs. I've put it back together so that you can see how the texts interact, but you see again these longer walls of text, right? In the yellow, in the blue, and in the purple. And again, you can pause and skim through if you'd like to. What I've done in fixing this paragraph is I've actually rearranged it a little bit. The paragraph is about nostalgia and the search for the past, right? To live in the past and to enjoy living in the past. And in part, that's because of this idea of a hopeful past versus a future where everything has kind of fallen apart. So the original order had Willie, the grandmother, and Gatsby. I've rearranged it to start with the grandmother because I view her as the one who least lives in the past and who has the least sense of the hope of regaining it, right? Willie seems to have that through his sons, Gatsby obviously has it, but the grandmother really doesn't. So let's look at how I've rearranged this. So again, what I've done is I've moved the grandmother near to the beginning. I've added the idea of like Willy Loman, right? Because this comes later in the paper, and we've established a little bit that Willy Loman feels this way. I've changed the transition sentence, and I've added a little bit here about the grandmother knowing that her best days are behind her, while Willie, right, still believes that there is something more. That idea was in here with Willie still believes that there is something more, that there is still potential. So all I've really done is I've added, while the grandmother, right, has this idea, Willie still believes that there's hope. I've connected Gatsby here. Gatsby too desires to relive his own path not taken, to break that up. I've left this Gatsby example unbroken up, and there's a reason for that. Gatsby's connection to the past is so much stronger than either of the other two that I want to have some time to go into this in detail rather than breaking it up and confusing the reader. This is a complicated concept. So I didn't break it up. But I added another synthesis sentence to the end with this idea that it's just as unacceptable to Gatsby as it is to Willie to continue on as things are, right? Because Gatsby doesn't kill himself but can't imagine continuing to live without Daisy. Willy Loman actually does kill himself because he can't deal with living in a present that doesn't reflect the past, right? So I've added that sentence in, and then again, there's a lot of synthesis at the end here. So I hope that through these various paragraphs, you've seen how you can use color coding at the end to really set you up to create an integrated paragraph, right? So if we go back to the one where I've color-coded it all in green, you can see how much more integrated it feels. And the same would be true if I changed the gray in any of these narratives.